My wallet is like an onion. Opening it makes me cry. Hello, everyone. I'm the Storyteller Daily. I will read a story that maybe one of you has experienced. So before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Lay back comfortably, relax, and let's begin. Story first, by Ethan Walker. For most people, commuting is the dullest part of their day. The same trains, the same crowds, the same mechanical rhythm of life repeating endlessly. For me, Ethan Walker, a 32-year-old office worker in London, the daily ride on the Northern Line was a ritual I barely thought about anymore. Every evening, I caught the 11:15 p.m. train from Moorgate Station back to my flat in Highgate. It was rarely crowded at that hour, just a handful of people, their faces tired, buried in books or screens. But one night, in September 2021, everything changed. It started with a woman I'd never forget. It was a chilly Wednesday night. The platform at Moorgate was nearly empty. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. The train screeched to a stop, and I stepped into the carriage. I took my usual seat near the middle, next to the window. That's when I saw her. She was sitting across from me, a woman in a green coat, her dark hair falling over her face. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers curled tightly together. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, unblinking. She looked wrong, like she didn't belong. Something about her posture, the way she seemed to fold into herself, made a chill run down my spine. The doors slid shut, and the train lurched forward. The woman didn't move, not even a flinch. I tried to ignore her. Maybe she'd had a rough day. Maybe she was just tired. But every few seconds, my eyes drifted back to her, and that's when I noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window was faint, almost transparent, like she wasn't really there. I blinked and shook my head. I was imagining things. The dim lights, the fatigue. It was messing with my mind. The train rattled through the tunnels, the familiar screech of metal on metal filling the air. I focused on my phone, scrolling aimlessly through news headlines. A few minutes later, I glanced up. The seat where the woman had been sitting was empty. I hadn't heard her move. The doors hadn't opened since the last station. I scanned the carriage. There were only a few other passengers, an old man dozing in the corner, a young couple whispering to each other. No sign of the woman in the green coat. A cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I leaned over to look down the length of the carriage. She wasn't there. I could still see the faint impression on the seat cushion where she'd been sitting. But she was gone. I sat back, my heart pounding. Maybe she'd slipped out while I wasn't paying attention, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. She had just vanished. The train pulled into Archway Station, the brakes squealing as it came to a halt. The doors slid open with a hiss, but I didn't get off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. As the doors closed and the train began to move again, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A reflection in the window. The woman in the green coat was sitting next to me. But when I turned my head, the seat was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I looked back at the window. Her reflection was still there, her face pale and hollow, her eyes staring straight ahead. Then her lips moved. Just a whisper. "Help me." I jerked away, my heart hammering in my chest. The reflection faded, dissolving into the darkness of the tunnel. I gripped the edge of my seat, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. But it felt real. Too real. The train pulled into Highgate Station, the last stop on my route. The doors opened with a mechanical chime. I stumbled out onto the platform, my legs shaking. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it didn't clear the fog of dread in my mind. The platform was empty, the lights flickering overhead. I turned to look at the train. The windows were dark, the interior empty. But then, in the last carriage, I saw her. The woman in the green coat. She was standing by the window, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a silent, desperate plea. Then slowly she raised her hand and pointed to the tracks below. My blood froze. The doors slid shut, and the train began to move, disappearing into the tunnel. I stood there, paralyzed, her final gesture replaying in my mind. She had pointed to the tracks, like she wanted me to know that's where she had gone. That's where she had ended. The next day I couldn't shake the encounter. The image of the woman haunted my thoughts. I decided to dig into the history of the Northern Line, searching for answers. It didn't take long. In 2019, a woman named Clara Morgan had died on the tracks near Highgate Station. She had been wearing a green coat. The report said it was an accident, a late-night slip on the platform, but some witnesses claimed they'd seen her jump. Her body was never found. Just gone. Vanished. I still ride the Northern Line, but I avoid the 11:15 p.m. train. And every time I see an empty seat across from me, I feel a chill creep up my spine. Because I know she's still there, riding the trains, trying to find her way back. And if you ever take the Northern Line late at night and see a woman in a green coat, don't look too closely, or she might just take you with her. Story second, by Olivia Carter. Working as a barista wasn't exactly where I thought I'd be at 28, but life has a way of veering off course. Hollow Grounds Coffee Shop was a small, quirky cafe nestled on a quiet street in Seattle. The wooden floors creaked. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, and the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans and cinnamon. I'd only been working there for a week, covering the evening shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. The customers were mostly students and night owls looking for caffeine fixes. My manager, Jasmine, was a laid-back woman in her 30s with tattoos peeking out from under her sleeves. "Nothing much happens here after 10, Jasmine said as she handed me the keys one night. "Just lock up, clean the machines, and you're good to go." Simple enough? Or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. The usual rush died down by 9 p.m., and I spent the last few hours wiping counters and organizing shelves. But on the fifth night, something changed. Something I still can't explain. It was a quiet Tuesday night, the rain tapping against the windows in a soothing rhythm. I was behind the counter cleaning the espresso machine when the door chime jingled. I looked up, expecting a customer, but no one was there. The door was closed. The street outside was empty. A chill ran through me, but I shrugged it off and went back to cleaning. That's when the order printer buzzed to life. I jumped, nearly dropping the cleaning cloth. The printer spat out a slip of paper. I pulled it off the tray, frowning. A single word was printed on it. Latte. But the register was empty. No orders had come through the system. I checked the tablet. No mobile orders either. I glanced around the cafe. The tables were empty, the chairs neatly pushed in. I was alone. I took a shaky breath and laughed it off. Maybe it was a glitch in the system. I made the latte anyway. Something about ignoring the order felt wrong. I set the cup on the counter, steam curling into the air. The smell of coffee was rich and comforting. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A handprint on the counter. Small, faint, and wet. Like someone had just leaned there, but no one was there. I backed away from the counter, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. The cafe was silent, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the windows. I shook my head. I was imagining things. That had to be it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and turned back to the espresso machine. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost gentle, like someone speaking from far away. "Thank you." My blood turned to ice. I spun around, but the cafe was empty. The latte I'd made was still sitting on the counter, steam slowly fading. I grabbed the cup, my hands shaking, and dumped the coffee down the sink. The cup clattered against the metal, the sound too loud in the quiet room. I needed to finish my shift and get out of there. But the night wasn't done with me yet. I kept myself busy, scrubbing the counters harder than necessary, my mind racing. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward midnight. As I wiped down the pastry display, I felt it again. That unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. Behind the counter, where the coffee grinders sat, was a shadow. It was faint, like a smudge of darkness, but it was definitely there. The shape of a person standing perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. My knees felt weak. I gripped the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. I had to get out of there. I hurried to the door, fumbling with the keys. My breath came in shallow gasps. The lock clicked, and I pulled the door open. But before I stepped out, I glanced back one last time. The cafe was dark now, lit only by the streetlight filtering through the window. And behind the counter I saw her, a young woman no older than 20. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, her apron stained with coffee. She looked sad. And then she vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The next morning I told Jasmine everything. The order, the handprint, the whispers. I expected her to laugh it off, but she didn't. Instead, her face grew pale. "You saw Claire?" she said quietly. "Who's Claire?" I asked. She sighed, her eyes misting over. "Claire was a barista here. 2 years ago she was closing up late one night. There was a gas leak she didn't notice. She didn't make it out." A cold shiver ran through me. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jasmine looked away. "I didn't want to scare you off. Most of the time she's harmless, just stuck, I guess." I thought about the latte, the whisper of thank you. "She just wanted to finish her shift," I said softly. Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, maybe she still does." I still work at Hollow Grounds, but I never close alone anymore. Sometimes when I'm making a latte, I feel a chill in the air, and every now and then the order printer prints a single word. Latte. I make it, and I leave it on the counter. And if I listen closely, I hear the faintest whisper. Thank you. I don't know if Claire will ever leave. Maybe she doesn't want to. Maybe Hollow Grounds is her home, even in death. But one thing's for sure. I'm never alone on the night shift. Story 3rd, by David Mitchell. The skyline of Chicago was changing. New skyscrapers seemed to sprout overnight, their steel skeletons clawing at the clouds. For me, David Mitchell, this was just another job, another construction site. I was the site manager for the Greenfield Tower project, a 60-story building set to be the newest jewel of the city. It was early March of 2020. Winter had finally loosened its grip, and the bitter winds were giving way to cool breezes. The foundation had been dug, the concrete poured. The crew was in good spirits and everything was on schedule. At least, it had been. Then the accidents started. At first they were minor. Tools going missing, scaffolding collapsing for no reason, workers reporting strange noises. but we all shrugged it off. Construction sites were dangerous places. Accidents happened. But deep down I felt it, a wrongness in the air, like the ground itself was whispering. I should have listened. It was a gray Tuesday morning when it happened. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a faint drizzle misted the air. I was on the second floor going over plans when I heard the shout. A scream. Long, high-pitched, and then suddenly cut off. I ran to the edge of the floor and looked down. Marco, one of our electricians, lay sprawled on the ground 3 stories below. His helmet was cracked, blood pooling around his head. My stomach twisted. I scrambled down the ladder, my boots slipping on the wet metal. By the time I got to him, his eyes were wide open, glassy. He was gone. The crew gathered, their faces pale with shock. Kevin, my foreman, knelt beside Marco's body, shaking his head. "He was harnessed," Kevin muttered. "I checked it myself. The line just snapped." I looked up. The safety harness dangled uselessly, the nylon strap cleanly severed, as if cut by a blade. But there were no sharp edges near where he'd been working. I swallowed hard, a cold dread seeping into my bones. This was no accident. After Marco's death, the crew grew jittery. The easy banter and laughter disappeared, replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. I tried to keep things moving, but morale was slipping. Then came the whispers. It started with Luis, a steel worker. He approached me one morning, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Dave," he said, his voice shaking. "I heard something last night." "What kind of something?" I asked. He glanced around as if afraid someone or something might overhear. I was on the night shift, welding beams on the 3rd floor. Everything was quiet, but then I heard it. I frowned. "Heard what?" He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Voices from the concrete." A chill ran through me. "What did they say?" He swallowed hard. "I don't know. It was like a language I didn't understand. But they were angry, Dave. Really angry." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things. That stress and lack of sleep were playing tricks on him. But I couldn't. Because the night before, when I was reviewing the blueprints alone in the office, I'd heard the same thing. Low, angry whispers coming from the walls. I decided to dig deeper. Something was wrong with this site, and I needed to know what. I went to the city archives, sifting through dusty old records and faded maps. The Greenfield site hadn't always been an empty lot. In the early 1900s, it had been a slum. Rows of cramped, dilapidated buildings. Disease had run rampant, and fires had swept through the area more than once. Hundreds of people had died there, trapped, suffocated, burned alive. Then, in 1921, the city cleared the area. The buildings were demolished, the rubble buried, and the land left vacant for decades. Until now. I sat back in the old wooden chair, my hands trembling. We hadn't just dug a foundation. We'd disturbed a graveyard. I returned to the site that evening, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the steel beams and scaffolding. The place was silent, the air heavy. Kevin was waiting for me, his face drawn and pale. "We lost another one," he said. My heart sank. "Who?" "Luis. He was on the night shift again. They found him at the bottom of the elevator shaft. The weird thing is..." Kevin's voice trailed off, his eyes haunted. "What?" I pressed. There were handprints on the walls, in the dust, like someone tried to catch him. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Kevin, we need to shut this site down." He nodded. "I already did." We turned to leave when a gust of cold wind blew through the site, carrying a whisper with it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. "You can't leave." The shadows around the site seemed to thicken, coiling around the steel beams. The ground beneath us trembled slightly as if something was trying to break free. Kevin and I ran, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the wind. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the door locked, my hands shaking on the wheel. I watched the site through the windshield, the skeletal frame of the building outlined against the darkening sky. For a moment I thought I saw them. Figures moving in the shadows, their faces twisted in rage and sorrow. The forgotten dead, the ones who never left. The Greenfield Tower project was abandoned. The city cited structural issues and safety concerns. They filled the foundation with dirt and gravel, sealing it up. But I knew the truth. We hadn't just built on cursed ground. We'd woken something up. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. A low whisper carried on the wind. "You can't leave." And I wonder if the ground is ever really at peace, or if it's just waiting for the next poor soul to break the seal.